The supporters of the shock therapy policies advocated by the International Monetary Fund and Jeffrey Sachs have been telling us that their recipes of so-called economic reform are leading Russia towards a bright future as what they call a market democracy. And I must say that any honest observer in the streets of Moscow can gather a tremendous amount of evidence that this is simply not the case. My direct observation in Moscow documents a mass impoverishment of the richest city in Russia. And it is an impoverishment which I think exceeds, let us say, the depths of the Great Depression here in the United States, when you had lines of unemployed American businessmen selling apples in the streets of American cities. Here is the spectacle that you can see in any large public square in Moscow, especially around the entrances to the Moscow metro, the subway, in the center of the city and around the principal railway stations. And of course, of these, there are about half a dozen in the Russian capital. What you find are hundreds, even thousands of people lining up in the entrances to the subway stations, the underpasses for pedestrians under the broad boulevards and so forth. And you see these large crowds, and you're seized by curiosity, what is it that they're doing? And as you get closer, you will see that these are hawkers. They're sellers. It's a kind of a bazaar. You could call it one huge distressed yard sale. These are wretched people who are holding up in their hands a single object, an item, product that they're trying to sell. You'll see people standing there with one bottle of milk, with one piece of cheese, with one loaf of bread. Sometimes people are trying to sell a pair of slippers, or a fur hat if they're lucky, or a few pieces of fruit, a bottle of wine or brandy. Now you can tell from the way that many of these people are dressed and from their manners that many of today's miserable sellers and hawkers were until recently members of the middle class. These are not people who have lived for decades in poverty. They are the new poor, the newly impoverished, office workers, teachers, and the like. And these are the people that under the realm of Jeffrey Sachs are now standing outside in sub-zero temperatures into the late hours of the long Moscow night. Now, when you get inside the Moscow subway, especially at the main transfer points, you find that the halls there are also lined by these hawkers. You'll find elderly people holding up 1, 2, or maybe 3 copies of newspapers, Moskovsky Komsomolets, Вечерняя Moskva, or some other newspaper. The prices are, of course, all subject to negotiation and haggling. I was lucky enough to buy a small map of the Moscow subway from an old man who had no teeth, and I paid a price of 200 rubles, I guess about 15 cents. And I was surprised that there weren't more old people. I was told that the elderly hawkers have become less numerous since last year, since many of them have simply died off. Now, in addition to the vast majority of the vendors who simply hold up some items in their hands, there are some that are more prosperous. Maybe you could call these the kulaks of shock therapy. Those are the people, the lucky ones are the ones who've got a folding table or who can pin several copies of different newspapers up to one of their sandwich boards. But at the other end of the scale, and quite numerous, are the destitute, old people and others, who have nothing left to sell, and who simply sit on the cold pavement making the sign of the cross and imploring the passers-by to have some pity on them. Now, I would challenge the American news media, television in particular, to explain why they don't show this reality, which is the first thing that any visitor to Moscow or large other Russian city would see. I would submit that all in all, these scenes can only be compared to newsreels of the apple sellers in the Great Depression in the United States, or you might compare them to the old film clips of impoverished German families selling their poor household goods during the hyperinflation of 1922 to 1923. I have had an opportunity to travel rather widely in the world over the past 25 or so years, and I must say that I have never in my life seen anything approaching the mass public immiseration that you have in the central places of Moscow. Now, Russian inflation during 1992 was certainly in excess of 1,000%. That is already hyperinflation. There is no sign whatever that inflation has diminished during 1993. Quite the contrary. During the time that I was there, the bread price was sharply increased. The fare in the Moscow metro was also increased. And what we're looking at today, at I believe January 1st, is an increase of 200% in the rents that are paid by apartment dwellers in Moscow. Let me just give you a piece of a recent article from the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung of Germany. Their reporter in Moscow, Elfie Ziegel, has written, not only pensioners, but handicapped citizens and families with children fear that they will no longer be able to pay their rents, that members of the so-called technical intelligentsia, scientists, artists, medical doctors, and teachers will lose their homes. It will be a question of time only before the next wave of beggars and homeless will hit the streets and central stations of Moscow. That's more of an honest report than you'll find, I think, in most American papers. Now, if you look at Russia today, a poverty-level income would appear to be in the range of about 90,000 rubles. Knowledgeable sources have told me that the average monthly wage in Russia today does not exceed 50,000 rubles. During my stay, and I think still today, the US dollar oscillated around an exchange rate of approximately 1,200 rubles in the public exchange bureaus. This means that as of the early autumn of 1993, 80 to 90% of the Russian population is below the poverty line. There are certainly coal miners in some politically sensitive regions like the Kuzbas who may nominally be earning 250,000 rubles per month. And I say nominally because the question for those people is, do they get paid or not? In many cases, it's clear they don't. On the other hand, the minimum necessary money to simply sustain a human organism in terms of food would appear to be about 30,000 rubles per month. Now, if you're a full professor, officially, you now make between 30 and 30,000 rubles per month. And of course, many pensioners come in well below that figure, so they starve. The extent of unemployment in Russia is much harder to estimate. There are some estimates that if workers on unpaid furlough and part-time employees are added in, the result could already encompass 7 to 10% of the workforce. But these are hard cases to describe. I met a young academic who was the holder of an advanced degree in chemistry. He theoretically had a job at a government research institute, but his monthly paycheck was approximately 25,000 rubles. Again, 30,000 is physical survival for one human adult organism. And this paycheck of 25,000 that the young man was getting was quite intermittent. So he was, of course, forced to moonlight, to scramble, to do anything to support his family. In another case, I met a leading fellow of a high-level government institute who told me that he and his colleagues had stopped getting paid in June, although they had gotten one more of these minuscule paychecks shortly after Yeltsin's tank attack on the parliament in October. I would submit that surely these people and their numerous counterparts in the state production sector must be considered as, in fact, jobless. They are unemployed. Now, as far as I know, there are no accurate figures whatsoever concerning the actual losses of production under the shock therapy regime. I would simply say that the case of Poland seems to be a little bit better documented, and I guess it was actually President Wałęsa who suggested in public on one occasion that as a result of shock therapy, Poland had come out with 1/3 of the production that it had before shock therapy was applied. So I would just guess, as a ballpark figure, that Russia is heading for something of this type. It is heading for about 1/3 of the level of actual production that had been attained in the late 1980s.